Mired in a cynical mood, a historian might sum up his profession in a single thought. A source can be found to prove anything. No other group of scholars has tried so valiantly to prove this point as the students of American slavery. Good morning. My name is Cate Peter, and today I'm coming to you with a problem. I will be introducing the Federal Writers Project Slave Narratives and the failure by the Library of Congress to effectively digitize them. While considering how we could design a database that actually functions for these narratives, I will be discussing them in their historical context in more detail to explain the digitization concerns that come with the sensitive corpus of historical documents. At the end of my presentation, I'm going to invite you to provide feedback, either through the question period or through email, of other things that I might consider, suggestions of solutions, and your own experiences with digitizing difficult history. A quick point of information before I go any further. The historical documents that I'm referring to frequently use the N-word. I will not say this out loud, and it will be censored out on my slides. When I need to refer to it as part of a quote or an official name, I will substitute a more appropriate word while doing this hand gesture. So now, a crash course in the Federal Writers Project Slave Narratives and their digitization by the Library of Congress, or why I get really cranky at the Library of Congress. So the Federal Writers Project Slave Narratives are the largest corpus of slave narratives in existence. During the late 1930s, the Federal Writers Project, which was created by the American government to help employ writers during the Great Depression, started an initiative to record the oral histories of people who had been born into slavery. By the end of the project, they had interviewed over 2,300 people. The interview transcripts, as well as some photographs of the interviewees and even some audio recordings of the interviews, were sent to the Library of Congress. The transcripts were edited and compiled by state into a huge multi-volume resource. In the early 2000s, the Library of Congress hopped on that wave of digitizing history and took a scan of all 10,000 pages of the interviews, and they plopped them onto this website. Now, I'm going to tell you all of the reasons why I hate this website. First of all, they replicated the exact organization of the books by organizing the files by state where the person was interviewed. This itself is really misleading. Just because someone was interviewed in Alabama doesn't mean that they were enslaved in Alabama or that they spent most of their life in Alabama. Moreover, this categorization is particularly questionable in this context because it erases the significant migrations and movements that happened when slavery ended. I also want to point out that a categorization invented in the 1930s is probably not the best way to categorize digital information in 2019. Now let's take a look at how much effort it takes to just read something on this website. So let's say that I want to read narratives from Georgia, so I'll click on Georgia. And it takes me to this, so I have to click on it again. And it takes me to these thumbnails, which are just so useful for understanding the information. Very, very useful and helpful. There's no built-in search engine to look through these files. Let's say that I want to look at healthcare or corporal punishment or marriage. Now, I know that all of those subjects are covered in this database, but unless I want to manually click through these thumbnails, I can't find it on this website. The best thing that you can do is download a PDF and then use the OCR reader in your PDF to try and look for things. But even then, a lot of the PDFs are too dirty for that to work. And unless you're really familiar with 1930s dialect spellings, you're going to have a hard time looking for the word because you won't know how to spell it. And even then, because dialect spellings aren't standardized in this corpus, you're also going to have to spell the word a bunch of different ways to try catch every instance of it. Next, the tagging of information, or lack thereof. The focus of the current tagging system is to find this resource within the Library of Congress's domain. It does not provide any kind of meaningful or useful way to navigate through the narratives themselves. Tags like older people and the United States really don't help me to find anything in these narratives. The very limited domain-specific tagging is basically just states and names. However, even then, while you might expect a state tag like Arkansas to include everything that mentions Arkansas, it actually has 4 photos that were taken in Arkansas. The interviews done in Arkansas aren't even tagged here. Similarly, you might expect that the name tags would show whatever pictures, interviews, and audio recordings are associated with that person. Again, it only shows photos. If you want to correlate photos and interviews in this database, you have to manually go through that whole clicking process again through their state to try and find them. If you want to listen to any of the audio recordings, you have to navigate to a completely different part of the Library of Congress's domain in order to see them. On a base level, there's a bunch of obvious improvements that could be made here. Domain-specific ontology, doing OCR on the documents, creating a functional search engine, providing users with resources on things like dialect spellings that would help them to navigate this database. Even just putting a photo of the person with their interview. Adding things like this would improve this failure of an archive. But to make a good archive, we need to know more about the source base itself. Which takes us to digitization concerns. This is one of the first oral history projects that was ever done. This is part of a movement of history from below, of asking people about their lives and recording that, and seeing that as a valuable and important contribution to history. So there's some good intentions here. But oral history doesn't get standardized as a methodology until the 1960s, and people are racist. So in the 1930s, what we see is a lot of intrusive administration, significant editing, and questionable interviewing methodology. For that administrative interference, I want to introduce you to John A. Lomax, a prominent figure in American folklore who significantly influenced the Federal Writers Project during his time in its administration. He was fascinated by some slave narratives that were sent in from Florida and commissioned the Federal Writers Project writers to collect more, which is what actually started this project. His instructions in overseeing the project significantly shaped the final results. For example, Lomax dictated how to record the dialect spellings used in the narratives, as shown in this very patronizing instruction. For those of you in the back, this is a letter from the FWP Associate Director to the FWP State Directors. It instructs them to make sure that they don't record the narratives entirely in straight English, that they just want it to be understandable to those unaccustomed to Black ways of speaking. Lomax also notably took the project from the Office of Black Affairs, where there were Black academics who had been encouraging this project for years, and moved the oversight of the project to his folklore department because of his personal interest. Knowing his influence, instructions, and values help us to read this resource. We can include information about him and what he told interviewers to do as vital contextual documents for reading these interviews. Now, significant editing. To make a long story short, all of these interviews have been edited significantly. They were edited by the interviewers at the state level and also by the Library of Congress. However, we have a lot of the paper trail that we can use for context. We can use assessment documents like this one. This shows us who the editor was, which is then another category and another layer of metadata that we can add onto the interviews. It also gives us more information, like the exact street address where the interview took place, which has some really interesting potential for mapping. It also shows some of the bias and, frankly, racism of the questions. For example, the question of whether or not the dialect is realistic. I know this is really hard to read, but I've summed it up here for this one. The interviewer wrote about reliability and value of the material that, based on firsthand experience with slight and vague slavery data and personal history of an indistinguished kind, the tone of the statements is honest, but the narrative contains nothing of value. The editor crossed out nothing and wrote little, has little of value. Comments like these give us a sense of what the interviewers were looking for and how the narratives were selected and edited. We could also add to the interface a way to compare different versions of the interviews, both to better understand the interview content itself, the way that they evolved through being edited, and the way that this project operated. This takes us to what I think is one of the most interesting and concerning parts of this project, and that's the questionable interviewing methodology. The questions which were designed by Lomax were poorly designed, biased, and often extremely loaded. They start relatively benign. There's some assumptions in these questions, but there's also more basic ideas of what's the name of your mother and father. They start to get pretty loaded, though, especially in the way that questions are grouped together. So in this example, different child's games are grouped with voodoo. And then for one of the last questions, which is particularly loaded, now that slavery is ended, what do you think of it? Which is grouped with, Tell us why you joined a church and why you think all people should be religious. Note the assumption of what people ought to believe and the way that an opinion on slavery is grouped with religion. Between the administrative interference, significant editing, and questionable interviewing methodology, this corpus is complicated to read and it needs a lot of context. Making this corpus accessible isn't just making it less of a pain to click through or designing it so that it's easier to parse for screen reading software. It's making it intellectually accessible by including everything that people need to know in order to understand this database. One of the resources that I've been referring to while considering this design is the Toolkit for Ethics and Tech Practice from Santa Clara University. It has a bunch of very valuable suggestions, including ethical risk sweeping, where you think about what choices may cause harm and recognize your ethical obligation to anticipate and respond to these risks. Expanding the ethical circle, inviting stakeholder input and participation other than your own, and actually talking to the communities that this could affect. And my favorite tool, think about the terrible people. Who will want to abuse, misinterpret, or weaponize what we build? Who will use it with alarming stupidity? And what rewards has our design inadvertently created for these people, and how can we remove them? These are quotes that I've taken from the narratives. I introduced this presentation with a quote from David Thomas about how a source can be found to prove anything. Now, there's a lot of reasons why people said these things. However, if you were just to read these, especially out of context, those reasons aren't readily apparent, and I have to think about the terrible people. There's danger in making this information more readily available on the internet, especially with the proliferation of far-right groups and slavery apologists. I have to be cognizant of what digital environment I'm entering into and how this information could be misused and misunderstood. Knowing how sensitive, complex, and potentially even dangerous the source space is, how do I design the archive? How do I digitize it? What specific things can I do to address these potential issues? I'm in very preliminary stages of figuring that out. Do I use sidebars to provide necessary context? Hyperlink everything and hope that people actually follow the hyperlinks? How can I design this with the least misunderstandings and potential for abuse? There's a couple things that I know I want to do. Detailed and extensive metadata tagging can help us to navigate the sources. Preliminary work done by scholars show us that the interview responses vary significantly based on the gender and race of the interviewer. Taking as many details as possible about the interviews and creating the possibility for text analysis tools like word clouds would create an invaluable tool for understanding the content and the trends of the interviews. I'm also considering renaming the archive. While many of the interview questions focused on slavery, these aren't just slave narratives. These documents provide incredible information about a whole generation that lived through not just slavery, but Reconstruction, the Great Migration, Jim Crow, the First World War, the Roaring Twenties, the Great Depression. Simply calling these slave narratives is restricting and somewhat misleading. I also know that I want this to be accessible, both physically and intellectually. And finally, while the Library of Congress has failed in their digitization of these stories, you know who's actually made searchable information about the interviewees? Ancestry.com. And this is incredible for me as a researcher because it means that I can contact the descendants of the interviewees in this source space. I can actually talk to the great-granddaughter of Patsy Moses and ask her what she would want this database to look like. I can contact the descendants of John Beckwith and ask if there's anything that they want to add onto this database. Do they have their great-grandfather's watch that they would like to put a picture of onto this? And this is an incredible opportunity for me as a researcher to really expand that ethical circle and really talk to the people and the descendants of who is in this archive. So what else should I be thinking about? What are other issues that I should consider? What experiences have you had with these sorts of issues and with sensitive, complex archives? This is my email. I would love to hear from you. Thank you for your time.
So do we have any questions for Cate?
Hi, thank you. Thank you so much for this presentation. I think the Federal Writers Project is really interesting because it was, for those folks in the room who aren't as familiar with the Great Depression, it was this attempt to, provide, paid labor to lots of people suffering from the Depression. And even with all of the obvious drawbacks, which you do such a great job of, it's still, there's something a bit utopian in the history of U.S. politics that we actually paid people to write. So there's two quick comments I have and a question. So the first is that if this is not already part, and I wrote down your email, so I'll email you all of this as well. If it's not already on your radar, you may also want to extend your research to the Historical Records Survey, because this was when there was actually an effort to document all of the records, so actually all of the existing archives in various U.S. jurisdictions, and a lot of that stuff ended up never getting published. But what's interesting about it, if you know about the history of the U.S. archives profession, Theodore Schellenberg was the big backer of that. And and I've written a little bit about this, so I can send you some of this, but Luther Evans, who would go on to become the Librarian of Congress and one of the directors of UNESCO, he actually oversaw a lot of the Historical Records Survey, and it had quite a lot. I think it had some cross-pollination with the Federal Writers Project, so that's thing number one. Thing number two that's really interesting, it was interesting to see the thing about Ancestry.com, because in the United States archival profession, Ancestry.com is really, it's very highly contested right now. There's a lot of concern within the Society of American Archivists to how much they sponsor stuff at our annual meetings, and that's primarily because in some of their digitization projects, they're using prison labor to digitize some things. So it's always interesting to me. Ancestry.com is this really highly contested terrain within American archives. But then the question I want to ask you, when you were showing us sort of how the questions, the questions that were obviously very preloaded, is that on the Library of Congress website itself? Is that part of those very, very badly OCR'd PDFs?
Yes, it is. So
Okay.
when you go back to that main page where they list out all the narratives, that is buried in the bottom of the administrative files.
Okay.
Which I think is a very bad place for
Right.
it. And I would hopefully want to design it to bring that forward more.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
This was a fabulous presentation. Thank you so much for doing it.
Thank you.
And seeing no other questions, please join me in thanking Cate.